fachika ilane iyam lagi efikos no ilane mutie
with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. A few months ago, I read their wonderful report, Mediating Self-Determination Conflicts. And I thought, wow, this is directly relevant to the conflict we're working on at Pathfinders for Peace, and that conflict being known variously as the Anglophone crisis, the Ambazonia War, or the conflict in the southern Cameroons. This conflict, which began in late 2016, early 2017, grinds on, causing deaths, injuries, displacement, destruction, impoverishment, disruption to education and livelihoods, and family separations, as well as the intangibles of fear and loss and trauma. We at Pathfinders for Peace are working to help get the conflict parties to the table for a peace process that will lead to a durable end to the conflict, in which the affected people can live with dignity, equality, and prospects for a better future. So I thought we could learn a lot from this excellent report. So I contacted Conciliation Resources, and I'm grateful that they were willing to do this event with us. Their report contains first general conceptual material, followed by several case studies. These cases offer lots of lessons of relevance to the conflict in the former British Southern Cameroons. So today we have the lead author of the report, Sally Holt, together with three other contributors, John Packer, Tahir Aziz, and Rachel Clogg. I'll introduce them one by one as they're about to speak, but broadly, Professor Packer Sally Holt first will give the general overview, and then John Packer will overview the international legal frameworks around self-determination. And then Mr. Aziz and Dr. Clogg will each present a case study. Tahir Aziz will be presenting the case of Kashmir, and Rachel Clogg will present about the Georgia-Abkhazia conflict. I should note that none of these cases are absolute victories for self-determination movements, but they have made some strides. And most importantly, we can learn a lot from them. We also have here today Sydney Perez, our undergraduate intern from the University of Colorado Boulder. And she's going to help with technical issues as they might arise, as well as following the chat box so that I can focus fully on the people who are speaking. She may jump in at times to interrupt and bring questions or conversations from the chat box to our attention. Finally, I'd also like to introduce Jonathan Cohen, the Executive Director of Conciliation Resources, who I've known through encounters at conferences and such for a couple of years, and congratulate him on the excellent work of his whole organization. So we are going to turn it over to Sally Holt. Sally is head of Accord, that's the periodical publication on peace processes, at Conciliation Resources. Accord has really been tremendously informative and fascinating to me for many years. And Sally, again, is the lead author of the report, Mediating Self-Determination Conflicts. So we will paste her bio into the chat. We'll do that for each speaker rather than talking through their bios. So you can read their bios there, and we will get right underway. So Sally, over to you.
Many thanks for the introduction, Suzanne. That's quite a lot to live up to. It's slightly daunting, but appreciated. And, you know, as I've said to you before, we were so glad when you got in touch. So thank you.
How you doing?
And to Pathfinders for Peace for inviting us to do this session. So good morning or afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. As Suzanne said, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the work we've been doing at Conciliation Resources on resolving self-determination conflicts over the last 3 years. and actually longer if you count the programme work that many of our colleagues have been doing for decades, and a couple of them will speak about that later. So the work is part of a partnership with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, looking at transformative approaches to conflict resolution, and as I say, focus particularly on contexts where self-determination is an issue. And essentially we were looking at three main, really quite basic questions. So we wanted to look at what are the distinct or the enhanced challenges for resolution that self-determination conflicts present, and then trying to identify some of the options and approaches that can be used for those seeking to address them. And then lastly, looking at how conflict resolution or peace building initiatives can better complement each other or even connect across a conflict affected context. And that's bearing in mind that in many of these self-determination cases, there may not be an official high-level political process, or there may be one, but it's stuck or dysfunctional, but there may be peacemaking or peace building efforts going on in different spaces. So I guess the first question is, why did we want to focus on self-determination? And I think the key reason, or one of the key reasons, is simply the prevalence of these kind of conflicts. So they include major conflicts that are currently dominating political and media attention. Look at Gaza and Ukraine. Recently, Trump's proposed takeover of Greenland and annexing Canada. But as we know, there are numerous others, and they often involve groups seeking respect for their identity and for their rights. We also know that these conflicts are very often protracted. So the conflict data tells us that they last about 30 years on average. And then the longer they go on, the more intractable they can start to seem and the more complex they become. One of the biggest challenges that we found is that self-determination is often mistakenly equated only with secession, so separation from a so-called parent state. And that often leads to polarized positions. So states fear disintegration of the state, while those with potential claims may go straight to demands for independence without necessarily being aware of or considering other options that could potentially meet their needs and interests. So in our working definition of self-determination, we've taken a much broader approach. So it encompasses situations where any party, usually, but not always a minority, is seeking more control over their own affairs. So that can be in the political, economic, social or cultural spheres. So in addition to this external self-determination involving territorial secession, we're talking about internal self-determination arrangements. So involving autonomy and control over certain aspects of governance, but within the territory of an existing state, but short of secession. And I think John will talk a little bit more about this distinction in his presentation. In terms of distinct or enhanced challenges, there are a lot, but some of the main ones to mention is this kind of linking of historical narratives to political arguments for self-determination, and then a common framing of claims related to identity and belonging and territory, which can be very emotive, and it makes them particularly complex and particularly hard to resolve. And then there's the fact that they tend to be asymmetric, so with the central state holding the balance of power, and then that makes it very difficult to incentivize them to engage with claims meaningfully. And again, my colleagues will elaborate more on this imbalance of power, on the challenges, but also some of the potential workarounds in the context where they've been engaged. And maybe the last thing to say about the challenges is, these conflicts very rarely involve a simple sort of one cohesive group versus the state dynamic. So, we face the usual challenges of understanding a context and a conflict in terms of many different stakeholders, often fragmented parties, and the way that they interact. The second main reason that we wanted to do this work is really because it's so relevant to our own work. So almost all of the contexts where CR works involve issues of self-determination. We don't normally use that terminology. As Suzanne said, Rachel will talk a little bit about work in the South Caucasus. Tahir can talk about Kashmir. We also work in Bougainville, in the Bangsamoro region of the Philippines, Ogaden region of Ethiopia. And in the report, what we've tried to do is to set out some approaches and some practical examples. We're trying to demonstrate that although these conflicts are really difficult to resolve, that there are things that can be done to try and help move processes forward, and to try and support people to develop more peaceful relationships. And a lot of this practice is focused on engaging with state parties and those with potential claims to kind of accompany and support them to work through different positions and options and try and sort of navigate some of the sticking points that are stopping parties getting into a process or have stalled a process. And our approach is one, we call it a people-centered inclusive approach. So essentially what that means is we're starting with the diverse needs and interests of the population as a way to kind of broaden out discussions, and to consider different options and try and help break down this kind of polarized positions that can quite often dominate at the level of the high elite negotiations. So a lot of our practice involves working with local peace builders and civil society, drawing on that local expertise. And it's not necessarily going to solve the high level political dispute, but it can kind of fill the gap by keeping dialogue alive. And also, it can make a tangible difference on the ground in terms of people's lives. I think the last thing to say is just we have to acknowledge that we're having this conversation in the context of a world in flux. So in terms of geopolitics, decline in respect or complete disregard in some cases for international law, but also this kind of changing and fragmented peace mediation landscape. So the shift away from kind of linear concepts of peace processes. We're also seeing more transactional approaches to brokering a deal as opposed to the kind of transformative, sustainable peace processes that we would like to see. And, as everybody here is aware, this presents many challenges, but, it may also provide some opportunities in terms of if the high level process isn't everything, then, there may be more opportunities in the different spaces and at the different levels outside of those high level negotiations. So I think I'll end on that slightly optimistic note, and hand back to you, Suzanne. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. Very substantive overview there. We are going to move right along to the next speaker. Now, as far as question and answer and audience comments, what we're going to do is go right on through to John Packer, and after him to Tahir Aziz. And then we'll take a pause for some questions before moving on to Rachel, because at that point, at the start of Rachel's presentation, we'll be turning off the recording. But so for now, why don't we go right ahead to John Packer. Professor John Packer is, Professor John Packer is the Neuberger Jessen Professor of International Conflict Resolution in the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa, where he is also the Director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center. And so, John, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Dr. Gase, and also for the initiative of Conciliation Resources and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, which have invited me to contribute to this initiative as an advisor. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of kind of the trajectory, both in historical development, but also in conceptual elaboration or the transformation of the idea of self-determination over the last century or so. And it is a relatively modern concept in international relations. So there are basically three phases from a historical perspective, but each of them showing how the idea has transformed. The first phase really comes at the end of the First World War, and actually still during the First World War, when or around the end of it, when Woodrow Wilson, former President of the United States of America, delivered a famous speech, his so-called 14-point speech. And then he talked about, and a lot of people attribute him as having enunciated the idea of self-determination. In fact, if you read the 14 points, you won't actually find that phrase, self-determination. But he does talk about determining, and he more specifically talks about the idea, which was prevalent at the time, about nations as the principal actors, so not states, but nations, within a European context, coherent political formulations, and the idea that they should have some effective say or be able to determine their own standing or statehood. Again, he doesn't use those terms. And this was, in more common parlance, reflected in the idea that kind of every nation should have its state or its home. And so you can imagine here a kind of mosaic. Borders of Europe were redrawn, partly to break up a multicultural or multi-nation state like the Austro-Hungarian Empire in particular, and to make them into kind of coinciding smaller units. So Hungary comprised predominantly of Hungarians. But of course, to take one example, but of course, what we were left with was non-coinciding. There was not a perfect match for lots of reasons, which will come obvious in a moment. But not all Hungarians were in the Hungarian state, neither in terms of their citizenship, nationality association, nor their territorial coincidence or coherence. So there ended up being parts of the nation which were not in the state, which became known as national minorities, on the wrong side of the line, so to speak. And for that, what was elaborated after the First World War and in the context of the League of Nations, a series of treaties, intersecting treaties, commonly known as the League of Nations Treaty System, which granted not only rights, but also entitlements to, Dr. Guess, you used the word parent state. So there was this idea of, Poles and Poland, but also Polish minority in another state, or the German minority in Poland, Silesia, for example. Now, this idea, and in the League of Nations, you will not find any mention of human rights or minority rights. So this was not a rights-based, in the sense of human beings, human rights paradigm. And it, of course, was problematical, and it gave, it partly engendered what became the antecedents and then the start of the Second World War, when the German Weimar Republic transformed to the Third Reich, and they started to act for their nation in the neighboring states. Initially, famously in Munich in 1938, the concession of other states that with regard to Sudetenland, but within the next year then with regard to Germans in other states, not to mention the Anschluss in Austria. I want to underline that the terminology at the time, which is very important conceptually, didn't talk just about nations, it talked about races. That there was and if you look at the judicial disputes within the Permanent Court of before the Permanent Court of International Justice, it was the German race, the Bulgarian race, the Albanian race. So these were discrete, non-contiguous notions that did not coincide with state or even this ambiguous and ill-defined, still today, legally not defined notion of nation. Now, that led to the Second World War. So that brings us to the second phase of this idea of self-determination. And critical things, without recounting a lot about history, but at the end of the Second World War, within the United Nations framework, the Charter, and then Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so forth, a few key things. First of all, the prohibition on the use of force as a means of settling dispute, or the duty, or the corollary duty to settle disputes peacefully, but also that explicitly in Article 1 of the Charter, and later in Article 55 of the Charter, which is primarily about human rights, this idea that self-determination is a right. But again, it doesn't define it. It doesn't explicitly state who the beneficiaries are, other than a new term is introduced, which is not races and not nations, but peoples. So the right of self-determination under positive law, international law, is a right that adheres to peoples. Again, ill-defined, some kind of a political project, not necessarily coinciding with state or territory, and so forth. Very importantly, also, the United Nations post-Second World War paradigm underlines not only human rights as a foundational notion to be protected, all human beings, irrespective of their belonging, and so forth, but also that with regard to political arrangements, the will of the people, Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that the authority of government shall be based on the will of the people. And this gave rise to this idea that it wasn't just kings and princes that made deals with regard to territory, state, nation, groups of people belonging, but it was actually the people themselves that in the formation of something coherent like a people should have a say. What happened in the second phase led rapidly to the decolonization process. So self-determination became actually manifest and expressed through the will of colonial or colonies that sought independence from external or colonial masters. And so this became the preoccupation in the post-Cold War era of the 60s, in particular in the 1960s. And there were two foundational resolutions, I won't go through them right now, of the United Nations in 1961 about independence of former colonies. But importantly, they identified three characteristics of a kind of entitlement for self-determination, with largely meaning independence and meaning statehood. And that was in the context of colonial regimes, so decolonization, foreign occupations, or racist regimes. And racist regimes was brought in primarily to respond to the prevailing apartheid regimes of Southern Africa. Now, in 1966, still in the United Nations framework, the two covenants on human rights articulated again in Article 1, self-determination. But let me just read the key provisions on it, because it doesn't talk about peoples or nations or anything like that. I'll just read the first couple of sentences. It says, it says peoples, but then it says, have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And for their own ends, it goes on, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to obligations arising out of international cooperation. And so it goes. So the rest of the United Nations. This implies transfrontier relations, interrelations between human beings, and it certainly doesn't talk about independence or statehood as such. So immediately the opportunity is raised about what are the alternative formulations that go beyond the 1960s decolonization or foreign occupation or racist regime context. Unfortunately, for the rest of the second period, this was suppressed because neither the UN Charter nor the two covenants allow any procedure through which assertions, claims, or contestations can actually be treated. So there's an enormous amount of frustration built up by those who might seek to pursue these things, but they cannot be adjudicated or otherwise considered through a deliberative procedure. Now, at the end of the Cold War, just to finish the phases of these, a new era emerged, and again leading out of Europe, but with a transnational scope, which was to look at things that might be short of secession or independence, particularly for purposes of stability in the post-Cold War era in Europe, breaking up of states. There was a decision to kind of follow an old idea of uti postulatus juris, meaning we will respect the administrative boundaries of sub-state entities, former republics of the Soviet Union, former republics of the former Yugoslavia, and so forth, and try to have stability out of that, but also open the idea that through negotiations, so secession is not prohibited in international law, but it needs to be pursued through peaceful means, and in particular through negotiated alternatives if there are no adjudicative alternatives. And within that concept, a whole new idea started to be much more articulated around forms of less than secession, less than statehood, which could be autonomy regimes, self-governance regimes, local forms of decentralization, also distribution of jurisdictional authority, not on a territorial basis, but through belonging, through, for example, religious or ethnic or identity communities. So the spectrum, and I'll conclude with this, where we come to is that the spectrum of the idea of self-determination and the kind of coherence normatively is towards widening alternatives and different forms or choices that could manifest self-determination, but we are still handicapped by the absence of procedural alternatives. Let me finish by saying in this, there remain two fundamental elements. One is the driving desire of peoples, if we wish to use that word, coherent political groupings who wish to have more say over their destiny, more control over their lives with regard to specific matters which affect them, or generally, for example, development perspectives. And the second thing I want to underline is a massive paradigm shift that we are experiencing globally, where statehood per se is now not able to deliver the kind of things we might have historically asserted to it. We're facing global threats such as pandemics, climate change, and so forth, which simply demand forms of cooperation of a transfrontier and new kind of paradigmatic means. And so this raises the importance of non-state or statist solutions, which might vindicate rights and satisfy legitimate concerns. I'll end with that and happy to respond to questions.
Wonderful. Wow. Lots there. I've got a bunch of questions in my mind, but we are going to move right along to the next presentation, which is by Taher Aziz. And Taher, you know, I've been pronouncing your name kind of more or less based on my knowledge of Arabic, but if you pronounce it differently, please let us know. So Taher is the Senior Advisor on South Asia for Conciliation Resources. And so he's going to do our first case study. Taher, over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. And yeah, you're close, almost there with my pronunciation. It's Tahir in Urdu and Taher is in Arabic.
Okay, sorry, Tahir.
Yes, that's it. Thank you. So I'll talk about the conflict of Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, and we'll start with the brief overview for those of the colleagues who might not have background, the context background into Jammu and Kashmir. These regions of Jammu and Kashmir were a princely state back in the times when the Indian subcontinent, Indo-Pak subcontinent was colonized. And in 1947, the decolonization gave birth to India and Pakistan as two nation states. And these states, the other princely states of which Kashmir was a part, but there were around 560 smaller states. Jammu and Kashmir was sizable with a lot of population, but diverse population divided along religious, ethnic, and regional lines, but nonetheless a state which had a very long association with its own identity, separate identity, and it did not fully sort of comply or merge into either the Indian nation state or the Pakistani nation state. So there was an overwhelming separate identity, but that was the political circumstances did not allow that identity to exist as a separate state, and hence the political circumstances prevailed, divided population along Indian and Pakistani allegiance, with a strong, of course, the sentiment of separate identity being there. War broke out between India and Pakistan, and the territory got divided into what is known as Indian administered Jammu and Kashmir and the Pakistan's administered Jammu and Kashmir. And it got divided by a ceasefire line mediated by UN, and that ceasefire line later on became the line of control through a bilateral agreement between India and Pakistan. So we're looking at a very long history, around 78 odd years. So initially, like right from the beginning, it coincided with UN's sort of emergence, but also the doctrine and the legal infrastructure around self-determination. Hence, UN intervened in the earlier circumstances and then promised through various resolutions a self-determination option for Kashmir. But practical realities did not let that happen, and India and Pakistan continued to contest that, and UN mediation efforts did not finally succeed, and it like ultimately paved the way for encouraging India and Pakistan to resolve it bilaterally. And those efforts continued for a very long time with sporadic violence, wars, and ultimately they also did not succeed. And then there has been a long phase of resurgence of violence based on, again, the clash of identity and clash of different persuasions and ambitions, but also a kind of challenge to the strict notions of what was known as self-determination and impossibility of it. So kind of a lot of dimension for internal self-determination or autonomy on both sides, and fluctuation with those rights given to the local governments and local people on either side. And so what you have today is a kind of a backsliding into revocation of that autonomy on the Indian side, and hence you have a pretty contested status quo. But what I will talk about is in the context and the topic that we are discussing in terms of engaging what the spectrum of self-determination could look like, and what has been possible both at official level but also mostly at the civil society level, for which conciliation resources has been a major part for the past 20 years. We have been working with groups of Kashmiris, but also with Indians and Pakistanis at multiple levels. And I think what we have learned is that these efforts have also been able to deconstruct this monolithic understanding of self-determination without necessarily directly kind of unaccepting it, without necessarily confronting it. There has been a massive common ground that looks at governance, as identity, as at dignity that you mentioned, and all other areas of work which form the needs and interests and confidence of people, particularly in Kashmir, but in both India and Pakistan. And one key thing to learn there is the use of language. In our own experience, we have found that using a language, a people-centered language, which looks at the principle of subsidiarity, looks at the people's right in areas of governance, without necessarily getting bogged down in the ultimate, the notions of self-determination. This has been very engaging in Kashmir. It did not require people to not look into those issues and discard what their ultimate political aspiration was. Without doing that, it's just possible to forge new alliances, new visions, new possibilities, new networks. And that has been very prominent across the line of control, that we spent a lot of time working with political groups, media groups, business people, and then there's a very creative formation of networks, of institution called Cross Line of Control, Joint Chamber of Commerce. Imagine like this line of control that has been there. It's the highest military militarized zone when you speak of Kashmir, for example, in 740 kilometers long line of control, very hotly contested, people separated. But then this period where there was a possibility for confidence building measures to emerge, and we have been very sort of integral to supporting that process, working with people on both sides, and that gave birth to institutions like Joint Chamber of Commerce. It's unheard of in that entire area. You can't, it still exists despite all those difficulties. Working with universities has been possible. It has been possible to bring media groups and work on climate issues, disaster management, because those issues matter for people who otherwise get very much marginalized by these high, political voices that are seen zero-sum and exclusive and all that. Another thing that we learned was like even the highest political level, when India and Pakistan started talking, and that was period 2003 and 2008, a very inspiring, quite unique framework emerged, which looked at, it emerged from the Indian Prime Minister's vision. He said, look, constitutionally, we might not find solutions to Kashmir, but there are other frameworks. And when he said other frameworks, he said, look, can we not look at Kashmir through the lens of insaniyat, which translates into humanity? He said, can we not look at through the prism of jamhuriyat, which is democracy? And he said, can we not look at Kashmir through Kashmiriyat, which is known in the area as a very inclusive culture, very non-violent and syncretic. So this inspiration actually translated it later, 3-4 years of negotiations, political negotiations, into a very inspiring framework which looked at line of control, because Indian position was that we can't change the border. It has to be the border. We can't change any territorial arrangements. And Pakistan was like, no, this territorial status quo is unacceptable. The common emerging point between India and Pakistan is including a massive amount of Kashmiris, including the secessionists and the self-determination people, was to look at the line of control from a different prism, which said, look, can we not make it an irrelevant thing? It doesn't change. It stays as it is, but it is also irrelevant. What that meant was it allowed to connect people across the line of control, the divided families, the trade, for example, was able to connect the former combatants, which were the most exclusive groups that were looking for secessionism, for example, but they got much involved and became much more articulate and ardent supporters of the peace building process, because it meant something different. So collectively, what this means is that it has been possible to look at different horizons through peace building efforts, which looked at it did not provide a substitute or non-recognition of human rights, including the right to self-determination, which is a very unhelpful thing to do. You can't, but without getting stopped there, bogged down there, it was possible to look at, and most importantly, working with groups along the line of control, including the self-determination groups, for their internal dialogues. Intra-party conversation have been a massive possibility and a space for that transformation, to look at a shared future. Today's situation is much more, again, hostile and gives a sense of impossibility. But if you ask anybody from the context, including in India and Pakistan and Kashmiris, if you say, look, what is the best possible solution that might emerge, or they will come back to the same framework of a shared future, which allows people to, just live together with this dignity, and which allows people for movement. It allows for a shared sense of sovereignty, shared sense of governance, shared sense of well-being. So yeah, that has been our overall experience, and of course, it's a long-term process. It requires much more resources to sustain it, and those kinds of issues we are all familiar with. And but yeah, I'll leave it here, and would be very happy to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Tahir. Okay, well, let us pause from our presentations right now for questions and comments. Now, let me, before we start with that, propose a few ground rules. First, of course, that you be respectful of the speakers and each other. And secondly, be concise. So comments are okay. It doesn't have to be questions, but please keep them brief and not make speeches. We prefer that you use the hand raise icon in Zoom, because if you just wave your hand in front of the camera, we might miss it. Whereas when you use the Zoom hand raise function, that will stay until it's lowered. And so if anyone doesn't know where that is, it's at the bottom of your screen. I think it's under React. You click on React, and then you'll see the option to raise your hand just above that. And then finally, please stay on mute at all times unless you're called on to speak. All right, with that, questions or comments? Okay. Ken, who I just met the other day in Denver. Nice to have you here, Ken.
Hi, you can hear me, I suppose. Sorry, I am multitasking at the moment. I'm out for a run, but I will slow down here to ask a question. My background, so I still work with USAID, and for now, and I am interested in climate, and I'm wondering how much folks are seeing or viewing issues of climate change and natural hazards driving some of these efforts at greater self-determination. Over.
Thank you, Kenneth. Would anyone, first let me see if there are other questions. Maybe we'll collect 2 or 3 before asking the panel to speak to them. I've got one in my mind that I'll ask of John specifically, and that is what happened. You referred to 1960-61 in the UN, and of course those are very critical years for Cameroon, and the Republic of Cameroon, comprised of the former French-controlled Cameroon, was established or obtained independence in 1960. And then the former British Southern Cameroons in 1961 was given through a referendum the opportunity to either join Nigeria or join the existing state of Cameroon. And so those were very critical years for the conflict we're looking at as well. So that's a question I have. Do we have maybe one more? Anyone else want to offer a question or a comment? I know all of you folks have lots of questions. I know most of the folks who have joined us. Nice to see you all. All right, well, why don't we start with those 2 first? So first of all, Kenneth McClure's question about climate and natural hazards and how those have played into self-determination issues. Anyone want to speak to that?
I can speak on behalf of our context. My assumption is that it is very relevant. It is sort of impacting political disputes, and including the self-determination disputes. In our context, in Jammu and Kashmir, a very prominent, fundamental aspect of it is about sort of the geography and the water resources that emerge out of water, and then the whole strategic contestation around it. And climate change has of late massively impacted that dimension of the conflict, where you have a whole cycle of receding glaciers and scarcity of water, and then you have massive sort of shifts in terms of populations and migration or threat to people. So it has challenged the traditional sense of border security, for example. It has challenged the traditional understanding around water distribution, and it has given a kind of a new imperative to think in terms of safety and security and livelihood of people. I mean, it's very, very prominent. So I would say it is hugely impacting as to what that self-determination definition meant long time ago in terms of the territorial integrity or territorial separation of things. Is far more now in the zone where you have to look at the survival of local populations, which might need to adapt to a new circumstance, and hence will need a kind to be acknowledged as the fundamental actors. And it has impact then somehow, hopefully, on the reframing and conceptualization of solutions and resolutions around those. So I think this is what we have seen in Jammu and Kashmir around disaster management, which has been a massive kind of element in Kashmir because of its susceptibility to earthquakes, to floods, and then climate change, changing the whole pattern and the rains and all that. And the whole region, particularly the Pakistani side, is dependent on the waters from there. So you have very new phenomenon which have huge, profound impact on people that cannot be just engaged with the same traditional kind of ways of nationhoods or territories or borders or definitions that we had. So yes, I would say massive impact.
It's one of those issues where state boundaries just don't make as much sense as frameworks for dealing with these kinds of problems and challenges. Yeah, exactly. Meanwhile, Sally Holt has posted to the chat, well, first of all, a couple of comments back, she posted the link to the report, the Conciliation Resources Sasakawa Peace Foundation report, Mediating Self-Determination Conflicts. And then in response to the question, she also posted a link to resources on peace building and climate generally, and on the Kashmir case. So thanks for that, Sally. John, anything to say about what was going on in the UN in 1960-61 with regards to self-determination?
Yeah, so two things, and I will also say something about climate change more broadly and paradigm shift. So in what I described as the second phase of self-determination, and particularly the first kind of 20 years after the formation of the United Nations, it was heavily associated with the idea of decolonization. So remember, the United Nations was formed with 50 states. I think the League of Nations was formed possibly with fewer. I can't remember the number. And within a fairly short period, the next 20, 25 years, the UN doubled its membership, almost entirely of formerly colonized, former colonies of European states. And so there was, and this was demand driven, but also in terms of a new paradigm of relations, trade, and forms of dependence and interdependence, but also the costs of conflict and so forth, this fit. So the articulation in the resolutions 1514 and then later resolution 2625 on friendly relations was really about, in a certain sense, updating or specifying the charter paradigm or vision for a new world order. So, there are these phases of new world orders or new international orders, NIOs. At the end of the Cold War, of course, President Bush Sr. announced a new international order. There have been people more recently talking about, are we in the midst of facing a new international order, and so forth. So it's no surprise that Cameroon was part of that, having had explicitly German, French, and British colonial, not only masters, to use this phrase, but also competition, and the invocation then, or the turn to referenda or plebiscites as a way of finding a legitimacy rather than merely dictation from the colonial master. Let me just say that we're up to almost 200 states now, 193 members of the UN, I believe it is, and more states, a good dozen or more non-state entities. We'll hear about one of them shortly, or a couple, which don't quite fit in this paradigm. And I'm reminded of former UK judge of the International Court of Justice, Roslyn Higgins, who had both been a member of the International Court of Justice, but also for some time a member of the UN Human Rights Committee that supervises the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And she once famously said that the world cannot function with more than 200 states. And so, sociologists and cultural anthropologists and others believe there's about 7,000 languages in the world. We're not quite sure about that because we don't have a really discrete scientific definition of language. And we certainly don't know what nations are and so forth, but we certainly know that there are many, many more than 200 entities, political entities, that would like to have something like statehood and are aspiring to it. So the idea that we can't functionally deal with it, that's a kind of 19th century mentality, or even older in terms of paradigm and vision. Now, in terms of how that, is problematical, climate change is a perfect example, because the international law emerged to deal with classic issues of climate or environment. For example, the oldest international regulated entity in the world today is not the International Labour Organization, created in the Treaty of Versailles, or even the UN Postal Organization that managed transfer of information through postal services or managed labor, big factors, global factors. But it's actually the Commission on the Regulation of the Rhine River, which was established to regulate the riparian rights and implications of upstream, downstream, and neighboring states around the Rhine River, which was crucial to development, production, was also the source of or central to wars over control of the Ruhr Valley and so forth. So the old ways of dealing with this were things like trail smelter decision. So if you had a factory in one state that polluted another state, there were essentially requirements of duties of care, but also compensatory regimes for harms done. Now we're living in a world where that kind of geography and state doesn't fit the world. So if we talk about climate change, we're talking about things in the stratosphere, ozone layer depletion. It's hard to identify causal effects. We're also talking about the way in which pandemics move through space and time. We're talking like old assumptions of the state and geography and kind of contiguousness or coincidence of people just don't fit. I'll give you an example. Since 2007, attached to the ground for local production consumption. So in this kind of urban, non-urban, I'll give you another example. Until not too long ago, 50% of the world's financial transactions took place in two cities. It used to be Hong Kong and London, England. It's now changing for other reasons. 50% of the world's financial transactions in two cities. So our world has changed. And now we're not even talking about normal currencies. We're talking about cryptocurrencies, which don't fit a state paradigm. So to go back to climate change, there is no way either to escape the kind of issues of global integration and cooperation. But it begs the question, what does self-determination mean? And what does independence mean? They don't they are nonsensical. They're almost oxymoronic. They don't mean, so we have to actually talk about degrees of say and influence and maybe control for affected or interested groups, and what are the forms. We have to be creative about this that could give greater or lesser say, a just say, a reasonable and effective say over people's lives. That's not only a matter of desire, because we can imagine a lot of things that we desire, but it's also a matter of reality. What is possible? And lots is possible. I'll end with this. Hopefully, more things are possible because of technology. Paradigm of state, a territory, territorial integrity, no longer have the same meaning they once had.
Thank you. Thank you. Very useful. So I think I want to turn it over to Rachel in just a moment. But before we turn off the recording, I just want to capture what I think maybe are a few key takeaways that I've gotten so far. And perhaps people can put their own takeaways in the chat. So one is that there are a lot of self-determination conflicts in the world. And secondly, the concept of self-determination initially really was meant with regard to decolonization, but that evolved over time. And it remains kind of not precisely defined, and certainly the peoples who have a right to self-determination are definitely not defined. But there is a growing recognition that it can take a lot of different forms. So so independence, statehood is one form, and then there are lots of forms of federal, decentralized autonomy arrangements that can achieve that self-determination. But that's just the sort of formal aspect of it. And then, I think Tahir's presentation really brought to light a lot of the informal aspects of it that are sort of say, okay, regardless of where the lines are on the map or what the current constitution says, these are people, and people can cooperate across boundaries, formal or informal ones, and can learn to live together and can learn to address the problems that they are experiencing, the actual impacts on their lives. It's sort of while others kind of deal with the formal diplomatic negotiations. John, I know that you had to leave at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you again soon. Let's see. Sally also talked about the asymmetric nature of most self-determination conflicts, which means the state party, or sometimes there's more than one state, as in the Kashmir case, but the state tends to be in the position of greater power, and therefore it's challenging to lure them to the negotiating table. So I guess I'm sort of hoping for some tips about that, although maybe there aren't any. So let's see. Those are some of the things that, and then finally to recap John's last point there, which is that even independent states have a lot less actual self-determination than they did some decades ago. There are more and more ways in which states voluntarily give up some sovereignty through international treaties, but also involuntarily, they're just affected by transborder issues of climate and disasters, and I could name others too, flows of drugs, diseases, and so on and so forth. So it's a complex world. All right, with that, I would like to hand it over to Rachel Klog, who is my notes are getting too mixed up here. There we go. Rachel is the Caucasus Program Director of Conciliation Resources. Thank you so much for joining us, Rachel. And with that, I will turn off the recording.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I'm Derek Dim. I want to thank the panelists for sharing their experiences and expertise. I've learned quite a lot, a number of things. I'm a Southern Cameroonian. So as I'm listening through, and I've listened to other sociologists and experts talk on the subject, those mediation efforts, they always are built on the reports that have happened on the conflict. And I have a particular worry, which is usually how those reports are made, especially case in point, Southern Cameroon. If you look at the reports over the years, some of the reports after 2018 from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they look like they are victim shaming. Because Southern Cameroonians, ultimately, if you look at the history, we are victims in the conflict to the regime and also to its international partners and the way we have been treated as a people for over 60 years. So we are a victim. But when you look at those reports, they are usually void of what happened before some people took up arms, what happened before people started advocating that they wanted outright independence or self-determination. So my question really is, how does international organizations and stakeholders, how do they ensure that they are accountable when they come in to mediate and suggest? How do they, what mechanisms are used to show that they are non-biased, and with geopolitics and interest and everything, they are not mediating for an outcome that they have choreographed? That is something that I really get worried about when I look at some of those reports. There's no time, so I can't point out to the specific reports right now, but I'm doing some writing on it. Yeah, that's a question that I have for the panelists. Maybe they can share some tips on how we engage with international organizations that are interested in the conflict. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Nadim. It's nice to meet you. I don't think we've met before.
Nice meeting you too, Susan.
Yes. Elvis Kometa, great to see you. Please, a brief question or comment.
Okay. I'm sorry I came late because I was busy at work. I would still like to attend the next session. But my question is directed to Jonathan. Jonathan, you talked about internal self-determination and external self-determination. So I'd like you to clarify us more about that.
Okay, thank you. Internal versus external self-determination. Festus Jing, nice to see you again too. Your brief question or comment, please.
All right. Thank you all for giving me this opportunity. I don't have more of a question but a comment to make, which has to do with the subject that Jonathan covered, that has to do with getting the parent state, as Rachel called it, to come to the table. And I think in the specific situation of La Republique and other conflicts that are going on around, I think that on the nation its own, or the government, the regime by itself, they usually would not be able to sustain not engaging. Their sustenance is based on external support that they get. So the supply of arms and then the supply of money to the regime helps them sustain, and then they dictate. So it takes a time, 40 years, 30 years, where we can't sponsor anymore. Then we withdraw. Then now they can come to the table to discuss. So I think that moving forward, we should also be able to look at what are other external states, what role are they playing to sustain any conflict that's ongoing. We will take the case of Israel against Pakistan, against what they're doing, Palestine. They depend on America and Britain for their arms to continue. Russia depends on North Korea for the supply of arms for them to continue committing the atrocities that they are doing.
Yes, that's a really good point, that conflicts do really get fueled by outside actors, including states supplying arms and money and soldiers sometimes. Right. All right, thanks. In the interest of time, I'm going to move right along to Jesse. Jesse, it's
I wanted the comment in the chat.
Okay.
Just
yes.
I could just read it.
Please go ahead, Sydney.
Princess, I don't want to mispronounce her name. Yeah. She said that mediators or any other stakeholders should invoke international law and the democratic principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Simple, also recognize the principle of equal sovereignty. I know that's probably a little more targeted at what the professor was saying previously. But
thanks a lot, Sydney.
Mhm.
And Jesse, great to see you, my friend. Quick question or comment?
Hey, Suzanne. Nice to see you again. Sorry I can't be on video. Hello, everyone. Great discussion. Really awesome. Even though I'm at work, I just had to attend this. I do have a question, though. I'm not exactly sure the presenter that spoke around this, but I think it's just the last one. He did speak about how we can bring state parties to the table, at looking at some of the ways. And one of those that he said is, in some cases, they have come to the table because they ask that the state can entertain, basically. They ask that they can live with. I know in the case of Southern Cameroon, we are asking for outright independence now, but back to Derek's point, there is a trajectory to this. Southern Cameroonians did not just wake up and started asking for outright independence. We have requested for just simple things. For example, can we just have equitable right of the use of both languages? Can we have official letters translated into both official languages to start with? That's a basic ask. So where we find ourselves today as Southern Cameroonians is not something that is not, it is the ultimate ask, because whatever we have requested, the government has ultimately turned around, arrested us, and killed some of us. Ultimately, that's what they've always done, irrespective of how small that ask has been. So they have never, ever come to the table, even if it is just to discuss issues of simple translation of official papers. That is what the consortium was. That's how the consortium started. And that's exactly what led to the arrest of some consortium members. And of course, the rest of them had to flee, and they have been on exile as refugees till today. So how do you deal with a state like that? A state party that has absolutely no conscience, is not even entertaining the least bit of issues that a people, which we rightly are asking that they should be addressed. Now, when we come to ask for outright independence, and if anyone has followed this revolution through, you would see that there was a time when the Southern Cameroonians was just saying, let's just go back to federation. And this was before federation, like, can you just respect our lawyers and our teachers? So there has been the lack of cooperation from the government, basically, has led us to where we are. And because of where we are, our people have realized that that is the best bid for us. We totally understand. We are not saying that if they come to the table, that's not the ask. Be ready to give us independence. We are saying, come on, let's discuss and see what parameters they are. Let's see what the process looks like. Let's look at what the options might be. So that is how do you deal with a state party like that? Because I think that is our biggest challenge.
All right. Thank you, Jesse. And so, yes, your point does combine well with Mr. Ndim's point, that it's not like you all just came out of the blue saying, let's have independence. There was a long period of time in which you were seeking just essentially equal rights, and then to go back to the federation that was officially in place at the beginning of independence and gradually got sort of eaten, if you will. And so how do you deal with a state in that instance? Was one of the questions. And also we're looking for the clarification of the internal versus external self-determination. And then also sort of what to say about the role of external states that are supporting, in this case, the state actor, which is then perpetuating the conflict. And that's, that's a hard one. As far as the human rights groups, Mr. Ndim, I hear your point that you're saying they're victim shaming. I mean, they're doing what human rights groups do, which is to just look at a snapshot in time and who is violating human rights standards, sort of regardless of what came before. That's just sort of the niche that they occupy. But nevertheless, your point is still well taken. So would any speakers like to speak to any of that?
I can come back briefly on a few points. I'm not sure that I can really answer the questions adequately, to be honest. But Mr. Nadim's point about the victim shaming and also the impartiality of the mediator, I think. I've been doing some work since the report, which has involved interviewing mediators, past and present, who've been involved in self-determination conflicts, including sort of classic ones like Arche. And the thing that they all say is it's fundamental that you understand the history of the context and, you know, are able to work with parties to untangle the historical narratives. It's also really important that you understand the legal framework and how that has developed, you know. So, for example, what happened to Cameroon in that decolonization process. You need to understand all of that in order to be able to understand where the parties are coming from. And that's on the mediator. It's also on the mediation team. Of course, the problem is, as we all know, is like you don't necessarily always get a good mediator, and then there's a whole set of questions about, you know, who is the mediator and why they've been chosen and why parties will accept or not accept certain mediators with a certain profile. But just to say, yes, I think it's understood that it's fundamental that you understand all of those dynamics if you're coming in from the outside into the process. And then just on the internal and external self-determination. So there's the very basic division between, you know, external is secession, essentially, and internal is the forms of self-government that can meet needs and interests within the state within which the party with the claim is currently living. But it's interesting that somebody that we work with a lot on Bougainville, Papua New Guinea conflict, is actually involved in that process at the moment, and he's done a lot of work with parties, particularly the Bougainville parties, developing a kind of typology of forms and levels of self-determination, going right from outright independence to, you know, the much lesser forms, but, you know, could be things like, as was mentioned, you know, linguistic rights within the state. And the interesting thing is there's the point that you can never, you know, no state is ever really actually completely independent because you sign up to treaties and you have trade and you have, you know, all of these kind of cross-border activities. But also that, you know, sometimes the group will want the symbolic things like, you know, we want to be a member of the UN and this is the most important thing because it's symbolic. But actually, when you look at the needs and interests, those can be met through sort of quite advanced forms of self-governance, which don't necessarily involve complete independence. So it's just, yeah, this is something that will be coming out. So we'll be putting it on our website, actually, hopefully in a few weeks, just as a kind of reference point. And then, you know, what you do with that typology is that you can then compare it to, well, what are the most important things? You know, what is it that you really have to have? What is, you know, what are the non-negotiables? And then see which form can match up. And maybe just the last thing to say is, yeah, getting states to the table. And no, I don't have a good answer to that either, but I've been reading something recently which is about neuro and cognitive science and in relation to identity and how groups behave. And a lot of it sort of reinforces what I think we already know, which is like when people are not given their rights and are not being respected and being marginalised, you know, you tend to entrench and then go for the sort of the more extreme form of self-determination. And it just occurred to me that maybe this is just another one of those tools with states to say, look, we've got scientific evidence that if you continue to marginalise, this is what's going to happen. I mean, you know, maybe that's not really going to persuade them completely, but that was just another angle that I thought was quite interesting. And Berghoff Foundation have done a lot of work on that, and I'll put a link to a report in the chat if people are interested. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Sally. Any of the other speakers, and on or off recording, I can do what you need.
Just a quick point. I think there was a discussion point around putting the sort of language in terms of the human rights as a fundamental part of the agreement. I think my sense is that if you try to have an agreement between the parties and between the states and in this case, the groups around human rights, it's a very kind of complicated, difficult. I think it's not impossible completely, but it just can be a source of dragging, and it just comes from a different instinct, as it were. It's just a competitive thing to share the blame and all that. But if the peace agreement nonetheless happens despite this being ambiguous about human rights, then there are chances that you can bring in human rights, because by implication the peace agreement then becomes able to invoke a goodwill and a shared sense of respect or dignity. I mean, it does not fix everything. It wouldn't necessarily, but what it implies is that it can bring in. So in our Kashmir's case, when agreement was almost around those, initially seen as intangible things, but then becoming concrete, there was a lot of goodwill to see the respect and possibility as, in the words of the Prime Minister of India, the sky would be the limit, right? There's no limitation as to what can be done in terms of empowering all of the people across the border. So I think the point I'm trying to make is it's a sequencing issue, maybe, what happens first. But it, of course, does not make the case to undermine or to not accept the principle of dignity or principle of human rights. But it's just a matter of you put everything in the political basket, then it becomes very difficult to achieve an agreement in the first place.
Right. So if I hear you right, you're saying sort of who did what to whom in terms of human rights violations might not be a very productive approach if the goal is to reach a peace agreement, but nevertheless, a good peace agreement will ultimately promote human rights, even if it's not stated as such in the peace agreement. Is that sort of where you're headed? Okay. And yeah.
I don't know if Rachel wants to come in on a few points,
right.
and I can follow after. All right, Rachel, I could go first if you want. I think silence. So thanks ever so much for the questions, and Sally kindly took the internal external one on, so I don't need to respond to that. Maybe I'll respond to one about the sort of trajectory of escalation that you've experienced in southern Cameroon, and your very understandable sense derived from brutal experience that the escalation towards a maximalist demand has been because of the constant rejection of efforts to address issues before you get there. And I speak as someone who, without detailed knowledge of the situation, by giving you the examples of Ethiopia and the Philippines, I was by no means saying this is what you need to do. I think it's just important to recognize that there are such examples out there. And in both those cases, the ONLF and the MILF had maximalist demands for long periods of time before they got to a point where they could accept that they didn't need to pursue the maximalist demand. Now, in both cases, the reason why they felt they didn't need to pursue it was because I think to a certain degree there was a change in approach from the state actor. And in both cases, we should acknowledge that for long periods of time, you could say the state actors had behaved in such a way where it was an absolute legitimate position to say they'd abrogated their responsibility of care for the population in the secessionist communities, but that didn't mean that it wasn't open for negotiation and a different trajectory was found. Now, in both those cases and for different reasons, there were very much contextual factors which enabled that to happen. And those may or may not apply now or ever in your situation. So I'm not trying to make a parallel there. I'm just trying to dispassionately say it's worth looking at other people's experience. But I do think it's important to recognize that state parties often are obstructive to the aspirations of people who want a changed relationship with that state party, whether it's an aspiration for full independence or autonomy. State parties have an exemplary track record of riding roughshod, and that's, to put it mildly, and we've seen in the two contexts where Rachel and Tahir speak about how that's happened in egregious ways, and clearly you're flagging that it has done so in southern Cameroon. The challenge is that how do you get a state to change? And there isn't an easy answer to that. If there was, we would have done it. But I think what I saw in regard to the MILF and the ONLF that I think is something to reflect on is they reached a point where they realized they needed strategies that contained maximalist demands and strategies that contained steps towards that. And they recognized for themselves that their maximalist demand wasn't working. And they also recognized they needed to find external allies. And that's not easy. And it doesn't, and it won't solve the problem. And I'm sure this is something that you've looked at, is what sort of external allies you can find and how they might be able to support your case, and how, and it ties in a little bit with the very interesting comment about the reports that are written that often characterize the victim as the perpetrator, and I think that it's such a complex challenge, because what then invariably happens is it pushes the victim into a very defensive stance, and for good reason. But when your strategy purely is focused on that defensive stance, it can make it very difficult to reach a point where you have a creative, expansive position. If I look at Northern Ireland, which people often don't think of as a self-determination conflict, but it's a classic self-determination conflict in many ways. Change came about for many reasons. One of those reasons was the party claiming self-determination was able to devise a strategy that held on to its aspiration of independence, or in that case, actually unification with the Republic of Ireland, but was able to do it in a way that opened up other options that would be staging posts along the way. And we're still very much in the midst of a political process. It moved from a situation of violence to a political process. And that might not be the situation you're in. In fact, I suspect it's very far from it. But I think one needs to explore these different trajectories and opportunities to stimulate thinking on strategies that can work. I'd also, so it's not a full answer to your question, but it's just some reflections on some of what we've seen elsewhere. I want to acknowledge the really important question about international law that was put in the chat, and it's a shame our colleague Professor Packer isn't here, because he is far more qualified than I am to respond on international law.
And I think that was Princess Ndifon's question.
That's right. Yeah.
Mediators or any other stakeholder should invoke international law and the democratic principles of the character of the United Nations, simple, and recognize the principle of equal sovereignty.
Yeah, and it's a tricky one, because in a way I'm not sure it's the role of a mediator to invoke such things. Sometimes it might be, but what mediators strive to do is create spaces in which the parties can find outcomes, not impose outcomes on them. And the dilemma is international law, sadly, does not get enforced. And so devising your strategy on the expectation that it will be enforced will probably leave you feeling disappointed. So you needed strategies that are layered, that make the points about international law and try and get international law to be adhered to, but don't depend on that adherence to international law as being your only objective. Because if it is your only objective, the chances are, especially in an asymmetric conflict where international actors are not going to take your back, you won't get anywhere. So you need to use international law, but recognize that politics more often than not trumps international law, unfortunately. I wish we lived in a different world, but we don't. And you have to live in the world, one has to devise strategies to deal with the realities that we face.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, all right. Rachel, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just
Well, I'm going to wrap this up. We've gone a full half hour beyond the planned time, but it really just started to get interesting right at the end of the 90 minutes when those of you who are from the conflict zone came in with your comments and questions, and I really wanted to make sure that we had time.
Mama, Iyam like the F, because no way, Lande, Mutia.